If you are traveling to Visayas-based cities like Dumaguete, Bacolod, or Cebu, then this video is for you. These are the domestic travel requirements going to Visayas via Cebu Pacific Air, Philippine Airlines, and Airasia. So stay tuned and watch the video to know the details. Welcome to Denzi TV. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you receive updates as they are posted. This video covers the domestic travel requirements of the following domestic destinations in Visayas, namely Antique, Bacolod, Cebu Province, Cebu City, Dumaguete, and Iloilo. Our first location is Antique, and let us know the requirements via Philippine Airlines for returning residents from outside Region 6. So these are the requirements that you need to prepare. First, a notice of coordination and notice of acceptance from the MCRA or Municipal Coordinator for Returning Antiqueños of the receiving municipal local government unit. Second is a negative RT-PCR, swab, or saliva test result. Okay, and it should be conducted after a 5-day strict quarantine from the point of origin, and test result was issued not earlier than 3 days before travel. And you have to pass a symptom screening, so you have to undergo a health risk assessment upon arrival at the receiving municipality, and if symptomatic, you have to undergo isolation and appropriate testing at the designated COVID-19 isolation facility. If you are asymptomatic, then you will no longer be required to be quarantined but shall limit mobility and adhere to the guidelines of the local health authority, specifically on symptom monitoring and reporting for at least 10 days. And if ever within those 10 days you develop symptoms, then you will be tested and isolated accordingly and managed at a designated isolation facility. Next up is still in Antique, but now we have the returning overseas Filipinos. So ROFs who have completed a 14-day facility quarantine and with negative RT-PCR result from the quarantine facility of origin may be assessed and transported to their homes in the province of Antique or may be fetched by their families. They shall no longer be subjected to reswabbing and facility-based quarantine by the receiving LGU, provided that the barangay or the LGU itself will closely monitor their health status and report immediately for any development of signs and symptoms for proper action. Those who have not completed their 14-day quarantine but with negative RT-PCR result from the quarantine facility of origin shall be subjected to complete the 14-day quarantine from the date of arrival in the Philippines at the receiving LGU, provided that the reswabbing will only be done if the ROF develops signs and symptoms while in quarantine. For government appours, okay, we have here the requirements. So travel order, mission order, and or travel itinerary and valid ID. So a negative RT-PCR test, swab, or saliva test result conducted after 5 days strict quarantine from the point of origin, and test result was issued not earlier than 3 days before travel. You have to pass symptom screening at the port of entry or exit or at the municipal health office of the receiving local government unit. Observe symptom monitoring and reporting and adhere to minimum public health standards for the duration of your stay in Antique. Next up is still in Antique via Philippine Airlines, but this time these are for domestic travelers or those travelers who do not belong to the previous 3 categories. These are the requirements you need to prepare. First is a negative RT-PCR, swab, or saliva test result, still conducted after a 5-day strict quarantine from the point of origin, and the test result should be valid within 3 days before travel. Notice of coordination from the receiving municipal government unit, and should be screened for COVID-19 symptoms at the port of entry. Let's proceed to the next location, Bacolod City, via Philippine Airlines, and these are the requirements for the returning residents or locally stranded individuals. First, a negative RT-PCR test result, whether swab or saliva test, valid within 72 hours. You have to register to SPAS and stay safe, backtrack, and health declaration form. So these are websites, and I will be posting all the links in the video description below. Next is for returning overseas Filipinos or ROFs. These are the requirements: negative RT-PCR test result, whether swab or saliva test, valid within 72 hours, must be tested upon arrival at the ETCS4 quarantine facility, and you have to register to the following: SPAS, stay safe, backtrack, and health declaration form. Again, the links will be posted in the video description below. If you are traveling to Bacolod via Philippine Airlines as an APUR, these are the requirements that you need to prepare: certificate of employment for employees, business permit for business owners, company ID or government ID, travel or work order, and registration to backtrack, SPAS, and stay safe. We are still in Bacolod, okay, but now let's have the requirements from Cebu Pacific Air. And for this airline, there is a uniform requirement for all inbound passengers: negative RT-PCR swab test result or saliva test result, valid within 3 days, and a printed or digital copy of the approved travel coordination permit issued by SPAS. Infants and toddlers may be exempted from this requirement if they have a valid negative RT-PCR test. Now let's go to the requirements from Airasia, still in Bacolod. For returning residents, RT-PCR test, swab, or saliva test result, valid within 72 hours, and registration to the following websites: Backtrack, HDF, SPAS, and Stay Safe, and with valid personal ID. Still in Airasia, and now let's discuss the requirements for overseas Filipino workers. Undergo mandatory RT-PCR testing upon arrival at the ETCS4 quarantine facility. So this talks about the arrival procedures that Filipinos coming from abroad go through when they arrive in the Philippines. So it's either in Clark, in Manila, or in Cebu. Next is the backtrack registration, HDF, SPAS, and Stay Safe, and a valid personal ID. Next is, still in Bacolod, via Airasia, but for returning overseas Filipinos or ROFs. So they need to undergo mandatory testing upon arrival at the ETCS4 quarantine facility. They should have a flight itinerary to Bacolod, passport ID with stamp upon arrival in the Philippines, contact number and address in Bacolod, and of course the 4 registrations: backtrack, HDF, SPAS, and Stay Safe. Lastly, for Bacolod via Airasia, for APURs, negative RT-PCR swab or saliva test result, valid within 72 hours, certificate of employment for employees, business permit for business owners, company ID or government ID, travel or work order, and backtrack, HDF, SPAS, and Stay Safe. Now let's go to Cebu Province. Requirements via Philippine Airlines. Let's start off with the returning overseas Filipinos or OFWs, overseas Filipino workers. Negative RT-PCR swab test result, quarantine certification issued by the Bureau of Quarantine, and valid ID. For LSIs or locally stranded individuals, we have to prepare valid ID, medical certificate, and you have to pass a symptom screening at the point of departure and arrival. For tourism and non-essential travel, you have to provide valid ID, medical certificate, and pass the symptom screening at the port of entry and upon boarding. Still in Cebu Province via PAL, for private APURs, you have to provide valid ID, medical certificate, pass the symptom screening, and comply with the minimum health standards. And lastly, for Philippine Airlines, you have the government APURs, valid ID, travel or mission order. You have to pass the symptoms screening, and you have to strictly comply with the minimum health standards. So as you can see, for Cebu Province, only returning overseas Filipinos and OFWs are required to produce a negative RT-PCR test result. All the other travelers, no RT-PCR test requirement. How about the requirements from Cebu Pacific Air for Cebu Province? For APURs, valid ID. For ROFs and including OFWs, quarantine certificate by or from the Bureau of Quarantine and a negative RT-PCR swab test result. For LSIs, all non-APURs and tourists, medical certificate issued by a physician valid for 7 days. And for tourists only, confirmed hotel booking from any resort or hotel in Cebu Province. Now let's proceed to the requirements from Airasia, still in Cebu Province. APUR, valid ID, travel authority issued by the department secretary or designated official. Other guests, medical certificate issued by a physician within 7 days before departure. Now let's go to the requirements for Cebu City via Philippine Airlines. If you are an OFW or a returning overseas Filipino, you have to provide RT-PCR negative result 3 days prior to departure, a Bureau of Quarantine certificate, and a valid ID. For LSIs, you have to provide a RT-PCR negative result valid within 3 days from the date of travel. And Safe, Swift, and Smart Passage or SPass, the TCP or Travel Coordination Permit or Travel Through Permit QR code. So this is coming from SPass. And for tourism and non-essential travel, again, a negative RT-PCR test result, SPass, and a TCP or TPP QR code. Still in Cebu City via Philippine Airlines, for private APUR, negative RT-PCR test result valid within 3 days, and a TCP or TPP QR code from SPass. For public APUR, government ID, and mission or travel order only. Cebu City, requirements from Airasia. Let's start with returning residents. Negative RT-PCR test result valid within 72 hours. A TCP or TPP via SPass. For ROFs and OFWs, we have the negative RT-PCR test taken within 72 hours before departure, quarantine certificate from Bureau of Quarantine, valid ID, and TCP or TPP via SPass. For transit passengers, those who are just passing by Cebu City, travel pass through permit via SPass only. For APURs, private APURs to be specific, we have negative RT-PCR test result valid within 72 hours, a TCP or TPP via SPass, work travel order, company ID, travel itinerary, round-trip tickets or travel details, and confirmed hotel booking. For government employees, we have mission or travel order, government ID, and TCP or TPP via SPass. Still in Cebu City, but this time, travel requirements from Cebu Pacific Air. For tourists and LSIs and returning residents, negative RT-PCR swab test result, valid within 72 hours, TCP or TPP through SPass. For ROFs, including OFWs, quarantine certificate issued by the Bureau of Quarantine, valid ID, TCP or TPP through SPass, and ROFs coming from Manila will be required to undergo an RT-PCR swab test in Cebu City upon arrival, followed by a 14-day home quarantine. So this is unique to the Cebu Pacific Air requirement. We have not seen this sort of protocol from the other two airlines. And lastly, for Cebu City requirements via Cebu Pacific Air, we have the APURs, government APUR, valid ID, mission or travel order, and the TCP or TPP through SPass. For private APUR, we have negative RT-PCR swab test result, valid within 72 hours, and a TCP or TPP through SPass. Now let's go to the requirements for traveling to Dumaguete City via Cebu Pacific Air. So, reminders to all inbound passengers, you have to register in www.dumaguete.com register dumaguete.com, and submit a clear copy of an RT-PCR test negative result, valid within 72 hours after the release of the result. After that, you will be receiving acceptance certificate within 24 hours after sending your requirement. Okay, and your travel must be completed within the validity of the acceptance certificate. For APORS, there is an additional requirement. So you have to submit valid ID, travel order, and travel itinerary. And for transiting passengers, you have to submit, again, a negative RT-PCR swab test result. And the LGU of the final destination must send a request to Governor Digamo through Mr. Bimbo Miraflor. The request must be emailed 3 days before date of travel and must be approved by the governor. So this is for the transiting passengers who are just passing through Dumaguete City. How about the requirements from Philippine Airlines for travelers to Dumaguete City? All inbound passengers should submit requirements, okay, via registerdumaguete.com. Okay, the requirements would be negative RT-PCR test result, valid within 72 hours. And after that, an acceptance certificate will be sent to you within 24 hours. Okay, and if you have the certificate already, then you can proceed to Dumaguete and you must observe minimum public health standards. Please take note that upon arrival in Dumaguete, a clinical and exposure assessment will be done at the terminal of entry. And if you are asymptomatic, no problem. You can enter Dumaguete without quarantine. But if you are symptomatic, you will be transferred to an isolation facility. Now let's go to Iloilo. Travel requirements via Philippine Airlines. For city residents and or those staying with city residents, these are the requirements: a TCP through SPAS, and obtain certificate of residency from the respective barangays in Iloilo City. So you have to coordinate with your LGU prior to your travel. For non-residents, TCP through SPAS, and a copy of hotel or accommodation establishment booking. If you are staying in Iloilo for not more than 24 hours, then you need to provide a TCP through SPAS, a negative RT-PCR test result, ID, travel order, travel itinerary, and you have to pass the symptom screening at ports of entry and exit. If you are staying for more than 24 hours, you have to provide a TCP through SPAS. A swab testing upon arrival will be conducted. Okay, you have to subject yourself to a mandatory swab testing upon arrival at the airport. And after that, you have to do self-quarantine after testing. The good thing about this is that you don't need to prepare ahead a negative RT-PCR test result because you will be swabbed at the airport upon arrival. So all you need to prepare is the SPAS. Now let's check the requirements from Airasia, bound for Iloilo. Returning residents, you have to provide the certificate of residency from your respective barangay, obtain a TCP QR code via SPAS, mandatory RT-PCR swab testing at the airport upon arrival, and observe strict self-quarantine at home, hotel, or government quarantine facilities until a negative RT-PCR test result is issued. So for returning residents, only certificate of residency and SPAS will be required because the testing will be done at the airport upon arrival. For ROFs, you have to secure also a certificate of residency, a flight ticket from country where you came from, and obtain TCP QR code via SPAS, mandatory RT-PCR swab testing at the airport also upon arrival, and you have to observe self-quarantine after testing. Still in Iloilo City via Airasia, for APORS, staying for less than 24 hours, and for APORS staying for more than 24 hours, the requirements are the same with what has been discussed already from the Philippine Airlines requirements. So there you go. You have to Make sure that you know how long are you going to be staying in Iloilo and follow the requirements accordingly. For the requirements coming from Cebu Pacific Air for guests bound for Iloilo, we have here all inbound passengers need to secure a TCP via S-Pass and a valid ID. So all guests bound for Iloilo City except for Apurs staying less than 24 hours should be subjected to RT-PCR testing upon arrival. Children aged 4 years old and below may be exempted from testing upon arrival and S-Pass registration provided that the adult companion has approved S-Pass. So this is sort of identical to the requirements already discussed, no, from the other airlines as well. So please take note of this. And lastly, for Iloilo City via Cebu Pacific Air, we have the additional requirements for Apurs. Negative RT-PCR swab test result valid within 3 days. Okay, this is only required for Apurs who are staying in Iloilo City for less than 24 hours. Valid ID, travel order, and travel itinerary. For guests traveling for medical reasons, you have to provide a medical certificate from a physician or hospital or a qualified healthcare provider indicating the medical services to be rendered for the guest and details pertaining to the schedule or appointment. That is for the requirements going to Iloilo City via Cebu Pacific Air. And those are the requirements you need to take note of if you're traveling to Visayas, specifically to these places, Antique, Bacolod, Cebu City, Cebu Province, Dumaguete, and Iloilo, via the 3 airlines in the Philippines. So domestic travel requirements, please take note. Thank you so much for watching. If you find the content of this channel valuable, remember to subscribe. Feel free to check out